So welcome everyone to our History of Christian Missions. We've reached part 18 today, and we've also reached the start of the 19th century, which is often called by Christian historians the Great Century for world missions. However, as I've been preparing this and looking at it, I've found out something rather interesting. I don't know anybody's done this before, but if you compare some of the dates of the start of the great historic missionary societies with the birth of some of the new pseudo-Christian movements, you'll discover some interesting correlations. For instance, William Carey established his first base in India when Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was born in Vermont in the United States. And when Mormonism, which is one of the older cults, was later granted official religious status, that was just 2 years before Hudson Taylor was born in the UK. Meanwhile, David Livingstone, the Scottish doctor and pioneer missionary, was 40 years old and soon to make his mark in Africa when Charles Russell, the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, was born. So it's rather sobering to realize that while pioneer evangelical Christian missionary movements were starting to spring up, some of the historic cults were simultaneously starting to grow alongside them. And I was reminded of the parable Jesus told of the wheat and the weeds, where we read that both the wheat and the weeds were left to grow up together until harvest time, when the weeds were separated, tied up into bundles and destroyed by fire, while the wheat was gathered and put into barns. So what was the state of the Christian faith and the church in 1800, in other words, the first year of the 19th century? Well, while Christianity was no longer a purely European phenomenon, it was still by no means certain at the dawn of the 19th century that it would be successful in turning itself into a world religion. By the end of the 18th century, any future growth of the faith was regarded by many as being rather unlikely. I noticed that Stephen Neal rather gloomily wrote that, quote, Christianity had been ejected from one Far East country, had been persecuted in another, and in India, it had hardly touched the higher castes at all. In Islamic countries, it had made virtually no impression. And in tropical Africa, the terrible climate had kept it on the coast. Well, those of you who were with us at the start of this series on the history of Christian mission, which was way back in September of last year, I hope you will recall that at the beginning, we looked at some of the reasons why it is true that Christ came at exactly the right time for the gospel to spread quickly. Reasons included that the Roman Empire had a worldwide peace, a Pax Romana, making it a safe place to be. Reasons included the fact that everyone spoke Greek, which meant there was no need for missionaries to learn another language. And also that the Romans had constructed roads that were straight, long, and safe for travel. These plus other factors aided the rapid spread of the growth by the early church. Now, when we come to the 19th century, again, we find there were a number of significant things that had happened or were in place which produced beneficial consequences for the work of mission. And I'm just going to mention three so we can understand what the situation was like. Three things: political, scientific, and religious. First of all, political. At the end of the 18th century, the revolution, the French Revolution, kicked off in 1789 and lasted for more than 10 years. It resulted in the overthrow of the monarchy with the execution of Louis XVI, plus the establishment of the French Republic, with Napoleon appointed first as a consul and later as the emperor. One result of all this was it led to a sort of new self-confidence within Europe, which soon manifested itself in a new spirit, wanting to trade, wanting to explore, wanting to conquer. And as time passed, some of these European traders became European settlers, who in turn became European rulers in foreign countries. So we had the Portuguese in Goa, we had the Indians in Goa in India, we had the Dutch in Indonesia, we had, of course, the Spanish in the Philippines, and Britain, which then ruled almost the entire Indian subcontinent, including Myanmar, as it's called today, or Burma, which is very much on the news at the moment. France annexed Indochina, and tiny Belgium colonized 1 million square miles of the Congo in Africa. Colonialism was well on the way. The second beneficial consequence is found in the world of scientific advance. Napoleon in the 19th century traveled at the same speed as Augustus Caesar in the 1st century. In other words, by a galloping horse, or maybe in other places on a camel. In those days, it took 6 months to reach India by ship. Cities in India took 1 month to travel between. But everything changed with the invention of the steam engine, because that meant steam ships. It also meant steam trains. And the later discovery of electricity was to change it even more. Today, you can reach almost anywhere in the world from almost anywhere else in less than 48 hours. In fact, most places you can reach in less than 24 hours. Captain James Cook, who made 3 major voyages of exploration, published the journals of his voyages. And those who read them discovered a new passion, a new interest for exploration, for travel, and for colonialization. Exploration also usually led to some form of exploitation. By the end of this period, Dr. Livingstone and Stanley had crossed and recrossed Africa and had really opened up that dark continent to the world. Both the North and South Poles had been reached, and Africa had been, like other places, carved up by the European powers, each jostling greedily for their own slice of the cake. Thirdly, not just political and scientific, but spiritual advance, and this is probably the most important of all. The Great Awakenings, including the second Great Evangelical Awakening, had started among the laymen in the United States of America. Indeed, America is really born out of this religious awakening and still affects that nation today. This awakening was characterized by an intense desire for individual and corporate prayer. Well, it crossed the Atlantic and it brought revival to our shores here in Britain, particularly and initially to the country of Ireland. And the new spiritual life expressed itself in personal witness and missionary service. And the year we usually remember this starting is 1858. And it was refreshingly non-denominational. And it produced a new phenomenon. The phenomenon was the interdenominational or non-denominational missionary society. 1858. It's interesting to note who was around in that year when there was this visitation of the Holy Spirit. Queen Victoria was 39 years old, and she had already been queen in the UK for 10 years. William Gladstone, who would be the former Prime Minister of Britain, was 49. Abraham Lincoln was 45 and would become President of the United States just 3 years later. Charles Darwin was 49. Charles Dickens was 45. Hudson Taylor was 26 and had just visited China 4 years earlier. And a young budding evangelist called Dwight Lyman Moody, D.L. Moody, was just 21 years old. This, friends, was to be the great century of missions. Now, I hope you all have a hero from the history of world missions. I hope you have someone who you particularly are interested in and read about. Today, I make no apology to unashamedly present to you my missionary hero. I have many heroes, but this has to be the greatest hero for me because he's the person who has had a huge impact on missions. I go so far as to say this, a greater impact on missions than probably anybody else. His approach, his methods, and his philosophy still affect almost every single mission agency today. Who was he? Well, let me give you a little bit of his CV. He was a botanist who discovered Carey herbaceae in the jungles of the Himalayan foothills. In fact, in his time, he was probably more known as a botanist than anything else. He brought the English daisy to India and introduced a particular system of gardening. He introduced the first saving banks into India. He established the first newspaper ever printed in any Oriental language. He introduced the subcontinent to astronomy to counter the negative impact of astrology. He pioneered the idea of lending libraries in the subcontinent. He wanted to expose Indians to knowledge. He stood against the oppression of women and the Hindu practice of sati, or widow burning. He saw that the gospel was to touch every area of life: the public square, the marketplace, the science laboratory, and the neighborhood. He was a cobbler, that means someone who repairs shoes, from England, but became a university professor of Oriental languages. He was undereducated, underfunded, and underestimated, yet overcame incredible obstacles to really spark the great century, the 19th century. He's known as the father of modern missions. Really, he was the father of Christian development. He was the father of holistic, integrated mission. And if you haven't guessed already, his name was William Carey. William Carey, more than any other, has stirred the imagination of the Christian world. There are at least 50 books published with his story and his biography. So, what makes him such a key figure and a hero today? Well, I think it's a combination of factors that I've already talked about. But we would also have to include that he willingly obeyed what needed to be done despite initial opposition. He came from a humble background and he did not give up. Perseverance really is the hallmark of his character. He was not the father of missions to India. No way. I mean, we've already looked at Ziegenbalg, who did a great work, I think almost 100 years earlier. And he wasn't the first Protestant missionary of modern times. He knew very well he stood as an heir of the many pioneers who'd gone before. And the whole of his story demonstrates the limitless potential of a very ordinary individual. And if he hadn't obeyed God's command, he would have remained a totally unknown person in the world. The reality is that because he was willing to step out and obey God, God used him, William Carey, to awaken the church to see that world evangelization was and remains their primary obligation. So, after all that, let's make a start with his story. Today we'll have just part one, if that's okay. William Carey was born August the 17th, 1761 in Paulus Perry. Paulus Perry is a tiny place. I think it had a population of about 800. It's near Northampton and is about as centrally placed as you can possibly be if you're going to go to the middle of England. He was born a year after Zinzendorf died, and significantly, he was born 8 years before James Watt patented the steam engine. William Carey's father was a weaver who worked on his loom in the family's home. So in their simple home, there was one room where the weaving loom was kept and where his father worked. Poverty was the default lifestyle for many. And while life was certainly not easy, life was simple and in many ways uncomplicated. To increase the family's income, Mr. Carey Sr. also taught reading to the lowest kids, as they were described, and acted as the parish clerk. The parish clerk was like a general dog's body. It meant doing anything from the accounts to the laundry. At 7 years old, William Carey, Jr., if we want to call him that, developed allergies from the sun, which stopped him from pursuing his dream of becoming a gardener. He earned the nickname Columbus because of his imagination that he shared with his friends. He had an Uncle Peter. His Uncle Peter had been a soldier who'd served in Canada, and he would tell William tales of ships and the seas and the Native American Indians and other wonders of the New World. And these are stories that William Carey never forgot. At the age of 16, William Carey was apprenticed to Clerk Nichols. Clerk Nichols was, as we say, a cobbler, a shoemaker or shoe repairer. And William Carey stayed there until he was 28 years old. But he wrote, "Until I was 14, I was addicted to swearing, lying, and unclean conversation, which was heightened by the company of bell ringers, football players, and the society of a blacksmith's shop." Now, while working in this shoe repair shop, one visitor came very frequently, a man called John Waugh. He was a believer, part of the Congregational Church, and he tried to convert William Carey using books and engaging in conversation. William Carey described himself then as a lukewarm Anglican, but he considered John Waugh's ideas to be radical ideas. So in this shoe shop, there were debates. And it seemed as though Carey nearly always had the last word, although he admitted to later feeling pangs of a guilty conscience. Nearly 2 years into his apprenticeship, when he was 15, those pangs of conscience became acute because of something that happened. As he delivered goods to the various customers in the village, the local ironmonger gave him a shilling, that was a coin, as a Christmas gift. When Carey went to buy himself a treat with the coin, he discovered it was counterfeit. So he secretly exchanged it for a real shilling from the money that his master, Clerk Nichols, had entrusted to him. And he decided to tell his master that one of his customers had paid in counterfeit. Carey later recalled, "I prayed to God to excuse my dishonesty and lying for this once. I promised I would never repeat such an action, but would break off with sin henceforth. But my wickedness prevailed, and I told the lie." Nichols, however, discovered the truth. And Carey says, "I was so overwhelmed with the shame that it was a considerable time before I went out." In other words, when he says before I went out, he stopped attending church services, although, interestingly enough, his new spiritual concern led him to prayer meetings. And he says he was gradually brought, quote, to depend on a crucified Saviour for pardon and salvation. But that decision wasn't crystallized until he was 17 years old. That was some 3 years after his lies about the money. So it was quite a long journey. However, he then desired to leave what he called the lifeless and carnal Church of England. He discovered in the shop, and I don't know why it was there, but he found a commentary on the New Testament with part of the text in Greek. And so he borrowed a Greek grammar and a glossary so he could teach himself Greek. And there, in the little cobbling shop in the middle of nowhere, the uneducated or undereducated William Carey's fantastic vision began to take place. In 1781, while he was still in his teens, he married Dorothy Plackett, known to everybody as Dolly, his master's sister-in-law. Now, she was 6 years older than him and gave birth to their daughter, Anne. Dolly was illiterate. She couldn't read or write, and on their marriage certificate, couldn't write her name, so she only managed to mark it with a cross. All her family lived around the area where she had lived all her life. Sadly, the daughter Anne died of fever before she was 2 years old, and Carey almost died from it as well. He survived, but one result was that he went bald. Now, initially, he would wear a wig, but he soon dispensed with that idea. The marriage was widely regarded as something of a mismatch. And as Carey's horizons widened, so the chasm between them grew wider. Then, following the death of his master, that was Clerk Nichols, the one who owned the shoe shop, Carey had responsibility for his late master's wife, now his late master's widow, and their 4 kids, plus the shoemaker's shop. a huge extra burden, and he was an ineffective businessman. His mother discovered this when she found how poor he was while she nursed him through his fever. Not only did he not handle money very well, but after opening an evening school to bring in some extra income, he also found he wasn't a good teacher. Well, William Carey began to speak in different churches. And after preaching at one local meeting, Andrew Fuller, the secretary, and you'll hear more about him later, convinced Carey, after they had together looked at some scriptures, of the importance of believers' baptism. Also, Carey would later declare that his most religious event when younger was reading Captain Cook's Voyages. He said, reading Cook's Voyages was the first thing that engaged my mind to think of missions. A number of Cook's journals were published, and those who read them had their minds opened for the first time to the realization of the existence of other different exotic cultures in the world. Well, in 1785, Carey was invited and accepted the call to be the pastor of a small Baptist church. By this time, he had 3 sons with Dolly: Felix, William Jr., and Peter. And later, he received a call to an even larger church to be a pastor, which he accepted in the city of Leicester. And slowly, the then revolutionary idea of a missionary society was beginning to crystallize in Carey's mind. He read a lot. He read atlases. He read the international news in the paper, and he pasted a map on the wall in the cobbler's shop, noting the location of the countries, the population of the countries, and the different religions within the countries. Now, the new master of the shoemaker's shop following the death of Clark Nichols was a certain Mr. Old. And Mr. Old recognized William's gifts and generously agreed to pay him fully while letting him work part-time. Carey was increasingly realizing that mission was central to the church's task. This, by that time, was a long forgotten truth, which was, when presented, regarded as revolutionary. Now, part of the reason for this was some of the erroneous beliefs that had arisen and were widely accepted. Amongst them was the belief that the Great Commission, those are those closing verses from Matthew 28, 19 and 20, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, etc., etc. The belief was that those verses were only given to the apostles, and hence that was not the task of the church today. It's always a bit dangerous, isn't it, to take a pair of scissors to the Bible and to decide what things Jesus said applied only to the disciples and not to us. But that's basically what they were doing. However, an opportunity was coming when he would be given the chance to make his point and correct this false thinking. A Baptist Association meeting regularly took place, which ministers would join and where different ministers would be free to present and discuss different topics. Finally, he got his chance and was ready to debate it. So he spoke. He said, regarding the Great Commission, he asked this question: was the command given to the apostles not binding on all succeeding ministers until the end of the world? You see, he was making the point that in the Great Commission, you'll remember at the end, Jesus promises he will be with us always until the very end of the world. So Carey said, well, look, since the apostles that Jesus spoke to had all passed away before the end of the world, surely that shows that the promise was binding on all successive generations of believers to go to the nations. Well, it is said that this is the response he received from one of the leaders of the Baptist Association meeting. Quote, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine." Well, while that story may be apocryphal, the sentiment certainly was not. It displayed a form of what we call hyper-Calvinism, popular at that time. By hyper-Calvinism, we mean that God is able to save his chosen ones from amongst the heathen, and he will do it in his own time, in his own way, without the need for us to help or work with him. As a result of this rather negative response, Carey wrote and distributed what is considered one of the great seminal Christian mission documents of all time. I won't give you the full title because they loved long, long full titles. I'll give you the shorter title, which is long enough. It's called An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. It's generally just called An Inquiry, which is an even shorter summary. It ran to 87 pages and was published in 1792. And it is considered as much a landmark in mission history as Luther's 95 Theses are considered a landmark in church history. In fact, it's generally recognized this pamphlet or booklet changed the Protestant Reformation, changed it from being only an inward-looking one of an existing condition of the Christian religion to that of an outward-looking movement to convert and incorporate non-Christian peoples into the kingdom of God. Now, more than a quarter of this book, more than a quarter of the pages detail the different countries of the world, their size, their populations, and their different religions, much as the map had on the wall of his shoe repairer's shop. It was really a prototype Operation World, if you know the book Operation World. And truly, it was the Magna Carta of the modern missions movement. Let me read to you the opening paragraph. It has been objected that there are multitudes in our own nation and within our immediate spheres of action who are ignorant, and that therefore we have work enough at home without going to other countries. That there are thousands in our land as far from God as possible, I readily grant. And this ought to excite us to a tenfold diligence to our work in attempts to spread divine knowledge among them. But that ought to supersede all attempts to spread the gospel in foreign parts seems to me to lack proof. Our own countrymen have the means of grace and may attend on the word preached if they choose it. They have the means of knowing the truth, and faithful ministers are placed in almost every part of the land, whose spheres of action might be much extended if their congregations were more hearty and active. But with the rest, the case is widely different. They have no Bible. They have no written language. They have no ministers. They have no good civil government, nor any of those advantages which we have. Pity, therefore, humanity and much more Christianity, and call loudly for every possible exertion to introduce the gospel among them. It was like a bombshell. It was a well-argued, well-reasoned case for the implementation of a missionary strategy. He divided his pamphlet into 5 parts, giving biblical reasons to counter the objections to missions that then prevailed. Well, I could tell you more. I could tell you more, but I can see our time has almost gone. So come back next week, because we'll see what became of this inquiry document. More important, what became of William Carey, and more important still, how that has affected us still today. So, you can all unmute yourselves. And we can bid each other farewell. Thank you for joining us.
Farewell. Thank you.
God bless you. Invite your friends to come.
Bless you.
Yeah, great. Nice to see you,
Gareth.
Dave. Nice to see you. Dave and Rusty, John and Iris. Wonderful. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Be safe, everyone. God
Kevin,
bless.
nice to see you, Kevin.
Please continue. Please continue.
Jonah, nice to see you. God bless you. Wonderful.
Thank you, Gareth.
Sanjay, God bless you.
Very much.
God bless you, Chris. And you can hear this again on YouTube when you receive the link. Kevin Ling, nice to see you this week. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malone. Thank you.
God bless your
God bless you.
Serbian ministry next week.
Yeah, thank you. I'm in Serbia next week.
Are you there in Bolton or online?
Not online. Yeah, I can't get there, I'm afraid.
No.
Yeah, I'll be back here